Good evening. It's 8 o'clock in Yerushalayim. This is WebYeshiva.org, and it's time to begin our series of shiurim on the halachot of income and charity. Specifically, what I'm going to focus on is ma'aser ksafim, the idea of a tithe. Tithe is the old English word for a tenth. The idea of tithing, the idea of giving a tenth of one's income for charitable purposes. Before we begin with the material, let me make some preliminary announcements. These shiurim, these classes, are all recorded and archived. If you miss a shiur or you want to review a shiur, these shiurim are available, the recorded versions are available around 24 hours after the shiur is finished. You just have to visit the WebYeshiva.org website, go to the class page for this class, and you have options of different ways to download the class, either audio or audio plus video in different formats. Now, most people choose the MP4 format as being the easiest that most people can use, but that you can choose according to your needs. If you have a question about any of the archived classes, feel free to send me an email inquiry. I'll give you my email address. There you have my email address on your chat box. Feel free to send me an email with an inquiry about any of the recorded shiurim. If you want to do that, just mention in your email the date of the original shiur, and you look at the timeline on the bottom of the shiur while you're watching it, approximately how many minutes into the shiur you're asking about. Then I'll know exactly what you're referring to, and I can send you back a response. If you have a question during the live shiur, during this live interactive shiur, feel free to type your question on chat. I will see it on my screen, and then I can incorporate the answer to your question in the course of the shiur. When you type your question on chat, you have the option of either sending the question to everyone, including me, or you can send it privately just to me as you like. Now, I know that not all of the participants and not all of the future listeners to this shiur on the archives are from English-speaking countries. I know that some of you have will find it easier to ask a question, to formulate a question in another language. But let me make a few points for those whose native language is not English. Si vous voulez, vous pourrez poser des questions en français. Wenn Sie wollen, können Sie Ihre Fragen auch auf Deutsch stellen. Se pueden hacer preguntas también en español si quieren ustedes. I have a number of other languages as well. If you want to correspond with me in another language, just let me know. Okay, so those are all the introductory points. Now let's turn to the material. I notice, somewhat to my surprise, on the screen at the moment is a piggy bank referring to the money which you're saving for charitable purposes, I suppose. Well, there's a message, a lesson to be learned in this as well. Halachically speaking, of course, we do not eat pork, but the isur, the prohibition of pork, chazir, is a prohibition of achila, a prohibition of eating. There is no particular prohibition to get benefit from a pig. If you have a belt or any other leather garment made out of pig skin, there's no particular prohibition in using that. That's fine. Although we are in general prohibited, although there's a rabbinic prohibition to establish a business, to set up a business in marketing prohibited food, if a pork or if a pig or pork meat falls into your possession, it's not your business, but you can sell it. There's no particular prohibition in deriving benefit from it. So besides just notices on the screen, let's turn to what I really want to talk about today, namely the tithe, the 1/10 of one's income, which should be set aside for charitable purposes. Let's see the sources and let the sources speak for themselves. It all begins, like most halachot, with a source in the Gemara. Now, in the course of my shiurim, I'm going to be quoting a lot of sources from Talmudic literature in the great poskim of the Middle Ages and modern times down to contemporary times. I don't have to mention during the shiur, I don't have to mention the precise source that I've drawn my material from, because you always have it on the screen in precise detail. And therefore, if you want to look up the source and get the content, well, you always have on the screen the precise sources. So I don't have to actually mention them in the course of the shiur. What it says in the Gemara is as follows. It's a very brief passage. B'Usha, in the town of Usha, Hitkinu, the rabbis instituted the following law. Now, Usha was a very important place in Jewish history. When the temple was standing in Jerusalem, the Sanhedrin sat in the Beis HaMikdash in the temple. They had a special room in the Beis HaMikdash, which was the seat of the Sanhedrin. Now, the Sanhedrin, which was seated in the Sanhedrin, the Sanhedrin, which was seated in the Beis HaMikdash in the temple, was both a judicial body, judging serious cases, and also a legislative body, legislating rabbinic law. When we speak about the distinction between Torah law, midaraisa, and rabbinic law, midrabanan, the source of rabbinic law is the legislation of the Sanhedrin. And we know the source of biblical law, that comes from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that comes from God. Now, after the destruction of the Second Temple, the Sanhedrin did not cease to exist. The Sanhedrin continued to exist for a time. Historians disagree about exactly how many years, but the Sanhedrin continued to exist after the destruction of the Second Temple. They just could no longer sit in the temple, which was destroyed. They moved to various places. There were 10 different seats that we know about, 10 different locations that we know about where the Sanhedrin sat at various times, and they were a judicial body judging, and they were a legislative body legislating. So when they were in Usha, this is one of the 10 places where they were after the destruction of the Second Temple, they legislated the following law. So in this particular case, we even know the historical origin of the law we are about to learn. In general, rabbinic law is rabbinic law, and exactly which century it comes from in general is not known. But in this case, we can pinpoint fairly precisely to the decades. We know when the Sanhedrin was sitting in Usha. Well, in any event, the text of the law which they legislated is Hamivazbez. In modern Hebrew, in Israel today, mivazbez means to waste. You can waste money, you can waste time, you can waste anything. But in rabbinic Hebrew, and that's the text we're looking at, mivazbez means to disperse, and not necessarily in a wasteful way, in a very productive way, to disperse money. Mivazbez, someone who's going to distribute money, someone who's going to disperse money for charitable purposes. Al Yivazbez should not distribute, should not disperse yoter, more, mechomish, more than a fifth, more than 20%, more than a fifth of his net worth. I don't know how much money you have in the bank. I know how much money I don't have in the bank. I know what my minus is in the bank at the moment. But whatever your net worth is, both in cash and in properties, you come up to a certain number of the total number of shekels, the total number of dollars, the total number of euros, of British pounds that you possess, and 1/5 of that, 20% of that, is the maximum which you are allowed to give for tzedakah. So here we see the ceiling. We are going to talk later about the floor, what the minimum is, but here we see the maximum. The maximum is chomish, 1/5, 20% of your net worth. Now the commentaries on the Gemara on this spot all come very quickly to the conclusion that the reason for this is that in the destruction of Eretz Yisrael after the fall of the temple, not only was the temple destroyed, the second temple, not only was the second temple destroyed by the Romans, but there was massive devastation throughout Eretz Yisrael, leading to grinding poverty among the Jews who survived the war. And therefore, the rabbis were very concerned that someone might give away, for charitable purposes, someone might give too much tzedakah and end up impoverished himself and have to turn to the community for support. And therefore, in order to prevent the possibility of people who could support themselves becoming impoverished and then depending upon the community, which had enough problems, they put a ceiling on how much you could donate. So Homish, 20% is the upper limit. Now, as far as this is concerned, the Gaon of Vilna, 18th century, one of the all-time stars, one of the all-time heavyweights in the history of halacha, the Gaon of Vilna, Rav Eliyahu of Vilna, wrote as follows: Gemilut Chasadim ein lo shi'ur. It says in the Mishnah, and this Mishnah is quoted in the beginning of the Sidur, in the beginning of Shachris. Every day, people recite this Mishnah because it's part of the Siddur. The Mishnah says the Mishnah was written before this legislation was made, and there the Mishnah says that as far as Gemilas Chasadim is concerned, doing acts of kindness, charity is an act of kindness, isn't it? As far as doing acts of kindness is concerned, there is no limit. Ein shi'ur, there is no limit. Now, ein shi'ur, there is no limit, sounds like there's no maximum and no minimum. So it sounds like until the Sanhedrin passed this legislation limiting tzedakah to 20% of one's net worth, people were free to give away as much as they wanted until this ceiling was legislated. But the Gaon of Vilna says, no, that's not what is meant. Hada begufa. This is referring to your body. What does that mean? When the Mishnah taught us that there is no limit to acts of kindness, the more the better, and there is no limit, as much as you can do is good. When the Mishnah said that, it was talking about performing acts of mercy, acts of kindness with your body, doing things to help people. Doing things to help people, there's no limit on that. This has nothing to do with spending your money. Spending your money as an act of kindness, there is a limit to that. Titnan, as we learned at the top of the page, if you're going to disperse money, you're not allowed to disperse more than 20% of your net worth. Vehu min ha-Torah, and this is an idea which is not of rabbinic origin, but the ceiling, the maximum that you're allowed to give is truly of Torah origin. That's much more serious, much more weighty. In the law of Torah origin, there's really no room for leniency. The laws of rabbinic origin, there are all kinds of rooms for leniency in all kinds of situations. But this is a Torah law that you're not allowed to donate for charitable purposes more than 20% of your net worth. And that's what is said in our dear Talmud, in our Gemara. The impression which is given at the top of the page in the Gemara, that this is all an innovation. When the Sanhedrin was in Usha after the destruction of the temple, the whole idea that this whole maximum, this whole ceiling that was legislated after the destruction of the temple, this impression that we got to the top of the page, Perush, the true meaning of the passage at the top of the page is as follows. Hayam Kodim Halacha Moshe Sinai. Since the days that Moshe Rabbeinu brought down the Torah at Har Sinai, there was a maximum of charity, 20%. Achakach, in the course of time, shachachu, the people forgot this halacha. There are plenty, according to the Gra anyway, there are plenty of halachas which Moshe Rabbeinu taught the people when he came down from Har Sinai, the laws that God had just taught Moshe. Moshe repeats them to the people, and in the course of generations, some of these laws got forgotten. Chazru b'yistuk halacha l'rishona, and in Usha they re-established what was always a Torah law. So even though we have the impression that the ceiling of 20% is a rabbinic ceiling, that's not the true meaning according to the Gra. According to the Gra, it was always a Torah maximum. Just they reinstituted it after the fall of the Second Temple. Well, what did they do in Usha? What did the Sanhedrin do in Usha? They didn't legislate something new. Sham chazru lahalacha Moshe Sinai hakaduma. They just restored the ancient Torah law. Okay. Now this opinion of the Gra. The Gra is a heavyweight. I mean, the Gra is terribly important. You know, those of you who are familiar with the Mishnah Brura, probably the single most important halachic work of the 20th century. When the Mishnah Brura is discussing the opinions of the various poskim in order to reach a conclusion about whom to follow, in any discussion, the opinion of the Gra, the opinion of the Gaon of Vilna is worth 20 points in any discussion by the Mishnah Brura. It's very important. But on this particular point, he's a Das Yochid, a unique opinion of one great rabbi. If the question is there someone out there among the great rabbis who holds that the maximum of 20% is a Torah maximum? The answer is yes. That's the opinion of the Gra. Now we're going to turn to the opinion of all the other great poskim who are going to tell us that the passage means exactly what it seems to mean, namely, the ceiling was first legislated in Usha and is truly of rabbinic origin. So we continue now with new material. What we're about to look at is a quotation from the Beit Yosef, written by Rabbi Yosef Karo. Rabbi Yosef Karo was, among other things, the author of the Shulchan Aruch. Before he wrote the Shulchan Aruch, he wrote the Beit Yosef that we're about to quote from. The Beit Yosef is an encyclopedic survey of the whole of halacha, one point after another, going through the whole body of halacha, and for every individual halachic point, he has an encyclopedic survey of the sources, the opinions of the great poskim, leading him to conclusions, of course. And then eventually, when he got older, he formulated the conclusions from the encyclopedic Beis Yosef. He reformulated them in brief form, and that's the Shulchan Aruch we have today. The Shulchan Aruch, which we have today, is basically a précis, basically a brief reformulation of the conclusions to be drawn from his encyclopedic work, the Beit Yosef. Yes, he was Sfaradi. And like in the overwhelming majority of cases, Ashkenaz and Sephardic opinion are identical, as in the case before us, where there are differences between the Sephardic and the Ashkenaz authorities. Of course, each team will follow their rabbis. Let's see what he says in the Beit Yosef. Incidentally, you understand from what I said that if you're learning a particular halacha in the Shulchan Aruch and you're interested in the sources, in the spectrum of thinking regarding what you have just learned in the Shulchan Aruch, the first place to look is in the Beit Yosef. because the Beit Yosef in the corresponding passage, the numbering system is exactly the same, so it's easy to find. The corresponding discussion in the Beit Yosef, the numbering system is exactly the same. And there you'll find the Mikorot, the sources, and the discussion of the spectrum of thinking on whatever issue you just learned in the Shulchan Aruch. That's really very important. Now, the text of the Beit Yosef reads as follows. Even though it sounds like the Gemara is putting a ceiling on charity, 1/5 of your net worth, even though it does not sound at all like the Gemara is encouraging us to give 1/5 of our net value, even though it just sounds like a ceiling, without particularly encouraging us to give 1/5 of our net worth. I mean, Yerushalmi, but if you look in the Yerushalmi, it would seem true mitzvah, that there is a mitzvah. The mitzvah means something which is commendable. Mitzvah means something which is praiseworthy. Mitzvah meaning something which is advisable, not exactly the same as something which is obligatory. But if you do it, it's good. It's something to be encouraged. It's praiseworthy. It's admirable. From the Yerushalmi, in the Yerushalmi, it sounds like what you should do, not what you have to do. But what you should do, what's good to do, what's advisable, what's praiseworthy to do, it's not exactly obligatory, is to give 1/5 of your net worth for tzedakah purposes. So, according to the passage we saw on the previous screen, 20% is the ceiling. Now the Beit Yosef is coming to say, not only is it the ceiling, it's the ideal. Not that you're required to do it, but it is the ideal. Gam mit Talmud Didan. That's what it says in the Yerushalmi. In our Talmud, that means the Babylonian Talmud, Yesh l'dakdek de mitzvah min amuvcha levaz beis chomesh. It also can be seen in the Babylonian Talmud that there's a mitzvah, that it's praiseworthy, that it's commendable, that it's good to give 1/5 of your property for tzedakah. The Maisi lahada kanas usha, and that's why this whole passage. How long is the passage? A few words about Usha is brought. Bottom line, the Beis Yosef comes to the conclusion that the 20% is not only the maximum, it's also the ideal that people should strive for. Now, if you think about it for a moment, this is a very curious idea, but it's a curious idea which runs through the thinking of the Beis Yosef, not only here, but in many contexts. The Beit Yosef has the following approach to Torah. The maximum is also the ideal. Now this puts the charity giver, that puts all of us in a very difficult situation. According to the Beit Yosef, what the Yosef Karo is encouraging us to do is to give the maximum. How much of a rabbinic scholar do you have to know that rabbis encourage you to do mitzvahs? You don't have to be a great rabbinic scholar to know that doing mitzvahs is something which is to be encouraged, which is admirable, which is praiseworthy. So, of course, the more, the better. But this gets us into a very delicate situation. You're supposed to go right up to the ceiling, right up to 20%. That's what we're recommending. That's what we're pushing people to do, to give 20% of the net worth, but not a penny more. It's prohibited to give a shekel more than 20% of your net worth. So what we're encouraging people to do, and this is a line of thought that runs throughout the works of the Beit Yosef, we encourage people to go exactly to the maximum, but be exquisitely careful not to go a shekel more, not to go a penny more beyond that. So it puts a very strong accountancy burden on everyone. We need some exquisite precision here in accountancy in order to be able to come to exactly the 20% which he's recommending, but not, heaven forbid, give a shekel more, which would be prohibited. Yeah, we're going to talk about the accounting cycle. Every how often this is supposed to happen. Later today, we'll get to the accounting cycle. How happy I am when your questions correspond with exactly what I have planned for the next few minutes. That means I've structured things correctly. Let's go on one step further. Now, the Tosafot, everyone knows how important the Tosafot are in the commentary on the Gemara. The Tosafot says as follows. First, the Tosafot quotes a verse from the Torah. Aseret ta'aseret kol tevuat zaracha. Take a tenth of all of the produce of your fields. Hayotzei sana shana shana. Take 1/10 of all of the agricultural produce every year and fork it over for charitable purposes, to the poor people, to the Kohanim, to all kinds of people who need it. And that's what it says in the Torah. Now, the Tosafot understands the verse in the Torah seems to be commanding us to give 1/10. Not seems to. The verse in the Torah is commanding us to give 1/10 of our agricultural produce for charitable purposes. This is talking about in Eretz Yisrael, the kedusha, the holiness of Eretz Yisrael requires that 1/10 of the produce of the land go for a charity. This does not apply outside of Israel. But in Israel, that seems to be what the verse is demanding. That seems to be, it is what the verse is demanding. Chayav L'maisa, you have to give 1/10. You have to give 1/10. You're obligated to give 1/10 of your agricultural produce. Now remember that back in those days, we, the Jewish people, were primarily an agricultural people. I know that nowadays Jews are primarily city slickers. I'm one myself. I know that. But it's only fairly recently in Jewish history that the Jews were kicked off the land. The Jews were an agricultural people until quite recently in history. It's only towards the end of the Middle Ages that non-Jewish governments in all different kinds of places kicked the Jews off their farms and seized the farms, were given them to non-Jewish owners, and the Jews had no choice but to migrate into the cities and became urban dwellers. Historically speaking, in the grand scope of Jewish history, that's a fairly recent development. So, of course, back in the good old days, when all was right with the world, and we were a farming nation, that's what most Jews were doing. They were engaged in agriculture. One's livelihood, one's income, one's livelihood depended upon the produce of the land. You grew whatever you grew and you sold it, and that was your livelihood. 1/10 was to be given. 1/10 was you were obligated to give 1/10 for charitable purposes. Now, Ribit, what if you're an urban dweller and the non-Jews prohibit you from engaging in most gainful endeavors? Most professions are blocked to you because the non-Jewish government prohibits you from doing this or from doing that, and the only source of livelihood left available to you is lending money out on interest. There's a historical reason why Jews became money lenders. They weren't allowed to do anything else. What if your livelihood depends not on raising crops in the earth, but lending out money on interest? And in the days of the Tosafot, that's exactly what was happening. The Jews moved from the land into the cities. Pragmatica, business, buying and selling merchandise. The Jews became merchants when we became urban dwellers. If your livelihood depends upon finance, if your livelihood depends upon being a merchant, call sharuvachim, or other kinds of income you might have, minayin, how do we know that you're supposed to give 1/10 of all of your profits, besides agricultural profits? Agricultural profits, I know the source, that says in the Torah. How do you know that you're supposed to give 1/10 of your other income? Finance, or income deriving from finance, income deriving from business, or whatever. I don't know that you're supposed to give 1/10 of that for charity. Talmud Lomar, the verse in the Torah has two extra words in it. The verse in the Torah could have said, Asher ta'aseh teruat zaracha. It could have said, give a tenth of your agricultural produce, but there are two superfluous words here. And what it really says in the verse is Asher ta'aseh et kol teruat zaracha. What are those two superfluous words coming to tell you? The word et in Hebrew, in biblical, even in modern Hebrew today, not so much in modern Hebrew, but the word et in Hebrew used to mean and still can mean with, together with. In modern Hebrew, this usage is usually limited to the names of business corporations. You know, so-and-so together with so-and-so incorporated. So if it's so-and-so and so-and-so incorporated, in Hebrew it'll be Freiman et Bein incorporated. You know, the word et means with. In modern Hebrew it's not used so much, but that's surely a very common meaning in biblical Hebrew. You have to give 10% of the produce in the field together with everything else. What's everything else? Income derived from business or lending money or whatever. It's called. You have to give 10% of all of your income. Now notice that the Tosafot is learning that the obligation of giving a tenth of your income flows out of these two words in the verse in the Torah. That means it's a Torah obligation to give 1/10. Giving 20%, it is indeed a ceiling, but giving 10%, you're nowhere near the ceiling here. 10% is obligatory according to the Tosafot. Havamatzi lemeimar et tvuatcha. Those two words could have been dropped from the verse. My call. Why does the verse add those two words? L'rabot ribit pragmatica v'chol davar shemaviach, to tell you that the obligation of a tenth is a tenth of the produce of the land, together with everything else that you profit from. According to the Tosafot, therefore, the obligation of tithing, of giving a tenth, is a very serious one. It is of Torah origin, and therefore there's not a whole lot of room for any leniencies. Now this is not far. Pragmatica means business, buying and selling. The position of the Tosafot that we've just seen on the screen, according to whom the obligation of giving a tenth of one's income is of Torah origin, is very similar to the position of the Gra, the Gaon of Vilna, that we saw on a previous screen. But I told you then that as far as the principal poskim are concerned, that's a maverick view, a minority view. Well, the Tosafot, the Gra was very important. The Tosafot are also very important. They happen to be on the minority side on this issue, very small minority, actually. Let's turn to some other approaches here. There's a passage in the Gemara, this time a whole different tractate, passage in the Gemara which says as follows: Le'olam al yimaneh adam, one should never avoid atzmo, one should never prevent oneself, milatet, from giving. One should never prevent oneself from giving. That means you should always give. You should always give shlishit hashekel b'shana, 1/3 of a shekel every year for charitable purposes. So we know there's a ceiling, a maximum, 20% of your net worth. We know that according to the Tosafot anyway, there's a Torah requirement, obligation of giving a tenth. And now we see that there's a minimum as well. The minimum which every Jewish person over the age of bar or bas mitzvah, the minimum obligation of tzedakah for every Jewish person is 1/3 of a shekel per year. Not an Israeli shekel. They didn't have Israeli shekels back in those days. A shekel was a silver coin, which they used back in the days of in late antiquity, back in the days of the temple. Shinamar, it says in the verse, and this verse is not in the Chumash, and therefore does not represent a law of Torah status. This verse is from the Navi, and therefore represents a law of rabbinic status. Ha'amidu aleinu mitzvot latet aleinu shlishit shekel b'shana la'avodas beis Elokeinu. When Ezra and Nehemiah led the Jews from Babylonia back to Eretz Yisrael to reestablish to reestablish the Jewish community in Eretz Yisrael after the diaspora and to start building the second Beis HaMikdash, the rabbis, headed by Ezra and Nehemiah, the great prophets, they were rabbis, instituted a law that everyone has to give 1/3 of a shekel every year for charitable purposes. Specifically in those days, the charity was supposed to go to support the Beis HaMikdash, which was under construction in those days. Now, if you know anything about the history of silver, you know that around 30 years ago, there was a major crash in the silver markets. Historically speaking, from antiquity until contemporary times, 35 years ago, not so long ago, from antiquity until quite recently, there was always a very close relationship between the value of gold and the value of silver. Prices went up and down all the time, but it was always, silver was always around 1/3 of the price of gold. An ounce of gold, an ounce of silver, a gram of gold, a gram of silver, however you weigh things, 3 measures of silver were approximately equal to 1 measure of gold. Historically speaking, that was more or less true. A little bit of an exaggeration, but I can't cover the whole of the history of world economics in a single phrase, I suppose. But in the 20th century, a certain Jewish family which cornered the silver market in Canada. There's a whole history to it, and there was a crash of the silver market. And today, the difference between the value of gold and the value of silver is immense. Of course, they both go up and down all the time. It's hard to pin down a certain value, but there's an immense difference. Gold is far more valuable per pound, per kilo, per anything than silver is today. Back in those days, my point is that back in those days, silver was much more valuable. However you measure value, it was a lot more in silver until the 20th century. It had much greater buying power, it just had a lot more worth. Now, how much is 1/3 of a shekel? The shekel coin, back in the late antiquity, shekel coins still exist. The Ramban. The Ramban was born and grew up in Spain, right, in the 13th century. The Ramban got into hot water in Spain. The Ramban was involved in a public dispute with Christians. The king of Spain convened a public debate between the rabbis and the priests. And the Ramban was called upon to defend Judaism against the priests who were going to defend Christianity. The Ramban, of course, did his best in that, but apparently he did too good a job because he felt the need to flee Spain immediately after that debate. He came to Eretz Yisrael. And when he came to Eretz Yisrael, among the many things he found in Eretz Yisrael were old shekel coins, which had been excavated. This is the 13th century. There still existed shekel coins from the days of the Beis HaMikdash. And indeed, these coins still exist today. Exactly figuring out their weight is a little bit difficult because none of the coins which exist still today from antiquity are in pristine condition. And therefore it's difficult to pin down their exact weight, but the museums which have these collections are pretty sure where do we find the debate about what? About which issue are we talking about here? The museums which collect these coins and publish they publish the exact dimensions, and they publish the exact weight, and they publish all they have about these coins. 9.6 grams was about the weight of in any collection of the works of the Ramban, you'll find the debate between, it's called Havikuach. Let me type that in Hebrew. It's called the Vikuach. The most famous collection of the works of the Ramban by Rabbi Chevelle, published by Mossad HaRav Kook. Rabbi Chevelle, published by Mossad HaRav Kook, is like a standard 2-volume edition of the works of the Ramban. Others have published the works of the Ramban. In any standard edition, you'll find a section with the text of the Vikuach, exactly what the priest said, exactly what the rabbi said. If you look in the Ramban edition, of course, you'll have it all in Hebrew. The same thing was published in Latin as well, which might not be as helpful for you. Well, 1/3 of a shekel anyway is around 3.2 grams. We might be off here by a little bit. Now, last week I checked the price of silver. Last week, in London, right, the silver exchange in London is the world basis for the price of silver nowadays. And last week, it goes up and down a little bit, but last week silver was running around half an American dollar per gram. And what we need here is 3.2 grams. What we need here is 1/3 of a gram, and therefore 1/3 of half a dollar comes out to around 18 American cents today as being the minimum which every Jewish person over the age of bar and bas mitzvah has to give for tzedakah every year. Now, that's not a lot of money in modern terms, but of course, back in those days, when silver was worth much more, this was it meant a lot more back in those days. Inflation has affected not only our currency, but inflation has affected the value of silver. Now, not all precious metals inflate in value, but silver has inflated greatly. Now, inflation is a phenomenon which we must live with in society. Not only does currency inflate in value. I'm old enough to remember when a carton of milk was 5 cents, but not only does currency inflate in a modern society, but you have to remember that inflation runs throughout the structure of society, particularly in to'arei kavod, particularly in honorific titles. There was a time not so long ago when the honorific title Rav or Rabbi meant that he was a well-trained rabbinic scholar. Today, someone has the honorific title Harav Hagaon. You can be pretty sure that he's probably keeps Shabbos, and that's about it. The value of the title has been depleted greatly in the course of time. It's not only money, but we're left here with a conceptual problem. The conceptual problem is, on the previous screen, we were taught, according to Tosafot anyway, Tosafot taught us that everyone has to give 1/10 of their income for tzedakah every year. And now we see the Gemara says everyone has to give 18 cents a year, 18 American cents a year for charity. We can't live with both of these halachas. These halachas contradict each other. Is it 1/10 or is it 18 cents, a flat rate for everyone? What's going on here? Some explanation is required. Well, let's see how the great poskim over the centuries understand this. We quote first from the opinion of Rambam. Everyone knows Rambam, Maimonides, 12th century. He doesn't need an introduction. These are his words. Ba ha'ani. Poor person comes to you. V'sha'al, and begged De machsero. He begged for what he needs to fulfill his needs. The poor person has needs. He needs food. He needs clothing. He needs whatever it is he needs. He comes and he begs for that. Ein yad hanoten maseget. And the rich person who's giving the money cannot fulfill all of the needs of the poor person. This is pretty typical. I mean, there's not enough money in the world to support all of the needs of all of the poor people in the world. Here we have one rich person and one poor person. This rich person is unable to satisfy all the needs of the poor person who appears before him. What should you do? Give him as much as you can afford. Give him as much as you can afford. Comma. But how much should you actually give? Ad chamishit nechasav mitzvah min hamuvcha. Giving up to 1/5 of the value of all your property, giving up to 1/5 of your net worth, 20%, is mitzvah min hamuvcha, ideal, commendable, praiseworthy, to be encouraged. It's good to give the poor person up to 1/5, 20% of your net worth. That's good. Ehad me'ashara b'nechasav. 1/10 of your net worth, that's half the amount, 1/10, 10% of your net worth, Benoni. That makes you an ordinary Torah-observant, kosher Jew. The Jew who is giving 20% of his net worth, you notice salary is not come into discussion yet. Salary is going to come up later. But the Jew who gives 20% of his net worth, he's the ceiling, the maximum, he's great. That's a tzaddik. The Jew who gives 10% of his net worth, he's kosher. No objections. Well, we can still encourage him to do more, but he's okay. He's kosher. Pachot makan, less than 10%, ayin hara, is stinginess, to be discouraged. We discourage giving less than 10%. That's stinginess. You shouldn't be stingy. La'olam lo yimana atzmo mishlishi tashekel b'shana. If you're going to be stingy and give less than 10%, there's a floor. You can't give less than 1/3 of a shekel, around 20 American cents a year. There is a floor below which you cannot go. So we have a minimum flat rate for everyone, 1/3 of a shekel, which runs around 20 cents. It goes up and it goes down. We have a ceiling, a maximum, which is encourageable, praiseworthy, 20% of your net worth, which for rich people is a lot of money. And we have Benoni, the middle path, which makes you a kosher, Torah-observant Jew. God is happy with you if you're giving 10%. He's even more happy with you if you're giving up to 20%. Anyone who gives less than 10%, anyone who gives less than 20 cents, anyone who gives less than 1/3 of a shekel per year, lo kiyam ha-mitzvah, has not fulfilled the mitzvah. Everyone has to do that. Even the poor person whose livelihood is from tzedakah, even the poor person who has no other source of livelihood beyond charity that people give him, chayav litein tzedakah la'acher, must give at least 18, 20 cents, whatever the value of silver is in his place, in his time, must give at least this small amount to some other poor person every year. So the Rambam has harmonized, the Rambam has resolved the tension which exists between the sources. All of the sources which we've seen up till now are correct. The maximum is talking about something that we encourage. The middle level, 10%, that is the standard practice for kosher Jews. And the 1/3 of a shekel, that which today is an insignificant amount, that's the rock bottom minimum. Less than that, you've not fulfilled the mitzvah at all. Now you'll notice that at the very top of the screen, where I give the sources, you'll see that this is a quote, word for word, not only from the Rambam. This is a quote, word for word, exactly the same in the Torah, which was the great predecessor of the Shulchan Aruch, and the Shulchan Aruch. All have exactly the same wording. So this is not only the opinion of the Rambam, this is the opinion which is subsequently embraced by all of the great poskim. Not surprisingly, once we have the Torah and the Shulchan Aruch copying word for word the opinion of the Rambam, of course, all the subsequent poskim fall in line with this opinion. This is it. This is the formulation of the opinion of the great poskim. Alternatively, if you want to look at things from a historical point of view, one could look at it as one could take it as evidence of prophecy. The Rambam, who lived in the 12th century, was able to formulate word for word the text of the Shulchan Aruch, which was not going to appear until the 16th century, 400 years later. And here we have a clear-cut proof of the prophetic abilities of the Rambam, that he was able to predict word for word what the psak, what the final decision of the Shulchan Aruch would be. Let's go one step further. What we're about to look at now is a text from the Bach. Everyone calls it the Bach, but really the name of the Sefer is Bayit Chadash. But if you tell someone you learned the opinion of the Bayit Chadash, they won't know what you're talking about. You have to call it the Bach. That's what everyone in the yeshiva world calls it. This book was written by Rav Yoel Sirkis. Rav Yoel Sirkis, great Lithuanian rabbi from the 16th century. Now, he says as follows, and let me assure you that in the course of my classes, this series of classes, I assure you that in this series of classes, I'm quoting only the heavyweight, the big name poskim. I'm not going to take the time to mention the opinions of lesser known opinions, rabbis of lesser significance, quoting only the major poskim here. He says as follows: Masha Adam Aser, the tithing, the taking of a tenth, the Masha Marviach, the Masa Umatan, the taking of a tenth from what you gain, from your profits in buying and selling, in business, B'ksafim u'shar revachim, or money you make not from buying and selling, money you make from ksafim, from finance, or any other source of income you have. The idea of tithing, that, giving 10%, ein chayav lo min haTorah v'lo midrabanan. This idea of tithing, giving 10%, is not obligatory. It is not a Torah law, and it is not a rabbinic law. In other words, it's not a law at all. There is no law. There is no halacha requiring us to give 10% of our business profits, our salaries, or any other source of income, unless, of course, you happen to be a farmer in Eretz Yisrael. If you are a farmer in Eretz Yisrael, you have to give 1/10 of the produce of the land for charitable purposes. No doubt about that. That's what the verse in the Torah said. But extending the idea of tithing from produce of the land here in Israel to any other source of livelihood is not a Torah requirement and not a rabbinic requirement. In other words, it's not required at all. Now, if you think about it for a moment, as surprising as this opinion might sound, if you think about it for a moment, you'll realize that we have already gone through quite a number of principal sources today. And if you think through the various principal sources we have already seen today, you'll realize that none of them actually requires giving 1/10. They all say how praiseworthy it is. They all say how commendable it is. They all encourage it. But they didn't actually say that it's obligatory. And that's a point which the Bach is making. It's not obligatory. And it's terribly important to always keep in mind the difference between Torah values, which are good, commendable, praiseworthy, all kinds of good things on the one hand, and Torah values, which are obligatory on the other hand. What you have to do, you have to do. What the halacha commands you to do, you have to do. What the Torah encourages you, what the poskim encourage you to do, well, that you have to take very seriously. But if you choose to reject the advice, if you choose to refrain from giving a tenth of your livelihood for charity, if you want to hover around the minimum of 20 cents a year, I wouldn't go exactly to the floor because, it's hard to calculate. The price of silver does go up and down from time to time. Let's say 25 cents a year to be safe. You want to give 20, you want to go down to close to the floor, give 25 cents per year. That's a pretty safe number. You're guilty of nothing. And being guilty of nothing, you have nothing to repent for, nothing to do tshuva for. You're okay. You'll make it into Olam Haba. You're not sinning in any sense of the word sinning, as long as you give around 25 cents a year would be a safe value. Maybe even get away with a little bit less than that. This gives us a number of great lessons. First of all, this teaches us a great lesson how to relate to other people. How are we to relate to other Jews who are not giving a tenth? Are we to scoff at them? Are we to mock them? Are we to distance ourselves from them? Well, we just learned that they're not doing anything wrong. They're not doing anything wrong. If they are giving a tenth, that's worthy of praise. We can heap our praise on them. But if they're giving less than a tenth, down to 25 cents a year, it's just a fulfillment of the mitzvah, and that's good, a minimal fulfillment of the mitzvah, but it is at least a fulfillment of the mitzvah. Okay, now of course, everyone finds himself. Everyone finds herself in different circumstances, and we here cannot deal with the difficulties in life that fall upon everyone in different circumstances. For some people, in certain circumstances, it might make perfect sense to minimize the amount of charity to be given. Here, in the context, in this forum, we cannot deal with everyone's personal life, and those who, for whatever reason, have decided to minimize giving charity, that's okay, as long as you don't fall through the floor, through the minimum. Now, the great poskim whom we've seen, the sources we've seen up till now, from late antiquity through the Middle Ages up until early modern times, of course, we want to see whether or not the more contemporary poskim fall in line with all of this thinking. It's very nice that we have all of these thoughts from the old sources, but it's always good to get confirmation that our understanding is correct. In terms, always better to get confirmation by the more recent, by the more contemporary rabbis. Maybe there are other sources we've not taken into consideration. Maybe there are other issues that we've not taken into consideration, which lead the contemporary rabbis to different conclusions than we have reached so far. So let's see if we can start to bring this down to modern times. Riavatz, that's an abbreviation for his full name. Rav Yaakov ben Tzvi was his full name. But he's not normally called that in the yeshiva world. In the yeshiva world, he's usually called Rabbi Yaakov from Emden. He was from the town of Emden in Germany, 18th century. He was from the town of Emden in Germany. He's usually called Rabbi Yaakov Emden or Rabbi Yaakov Mi Emden. He was one of the big names in the 18th century, if not the biggest name. And let's see what he wrote on this issue. It would seem to be correct that those who say that there is no Torah obligation to give a tenth are right. Those who say there's no Torah obligation to give a tenth are right, as long as we're not talking about agricultural produce. They're right in the sense that it's not obligatory to give a tenth. He agrees exactly with the conclusions we've reached up till now. As far as midat chasidut is concerned, as far as an act of piety above and beyond what is required, midat chasidut, an act of piety above and beyond what is required, as far as acts of piety are concerned, above and beyond what is required by Jewish law, there is a source calling for 10%, and Ikar Divrei Avinu Azaken. And this is what Avram Avinu taught us in the Chumash. Kol asher titein li, Avram Avinu said in the Chumash to God, Avram said, whatever you give me, whether it's produce in the field, or income from selling my sheep, or whatever you give me, God, Asher Asrenu, I'll give a tenth. Avram Avinu already had the practice, the minhag, the practice, not a requirement. Avram Avinu already had the practice of giving 10% of his income for charity. So of course the model of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, of course the model given to us by the way the great personalities of Torah acted is of course a proper model for how to act for those who want to live their lives. Right, Yaakov. I said Avram. It's Yaakov, correct? The model of imitating the conduct of the great personalities of Torah is, of course, a good idea. Of course, that's midat chasidut. Of course, it's an act of piety above and beyond what is required to act like the Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. This is a point made by many acharodim, but at this point, we have run out of time, and therefore we're going to pause with this. And next time, of course, we're going to look at the other side of the coin. Next time, we're going to look at those who disagree with everything we've said up till now. But that will be for next week. Until then, I wish you a good week and a Shabbat Shalom, and look forward to seeing you all again a week from tonight. Till then, Shalom, Shalom.